Welcome, welcome, John.
Hi, how are you?
Oh, I'm just living the dream.
You don't seem like super energetic this morning, Molly. What's
I
going on?
I'm energetic. I went
D-
to a party last night, but
What
I'm
was the
energetic.
where was the party?
Was at the High Line. It was good. American life grinds on despite the fact that our political system is in what do you think what would you say the sort of word is for this moment in American politics?
Surreal. I mean, just sort of terra incognita, if you want to be like Latin. This has been true in both Trump terms, but this is one
Right.
thing that's not different, but it's just like there's just so many things for which there is no precedent. And I'm like tediously it's not like I'm some like, some great historical scholar or something, but just like I'm always like looking for some precedent. Like
Right.
how do we evaluate this thing? Well, this has happened before and this is how it kind of came out. So there's a guide to this, or this has happened a lot before, or well, it hasn't
Right.
happened very often, but there have been times when this has happened or something like this has happened. But there's just constantly every day there's like five things that there's no metric or yardstick where you're kind of like, well, here's how we can get some general sense of how this might unfold on the basis of this thing that happened in 1964. It's like just I don't
Right.
know. Like I look up and go, I don't know. I mean, what do you think's going to happen, John? I have no idea.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, there is, but it does feel like with Trumpism, there's always a sort of feeling that maybe someone will do something, right? Like that Republicans, there's sort of
Oh,
a wish, and I mean that ship is.
I don't have that. I don't have that feeling at all. I gave up on that feeling a long time ago.
So we talk about the guardrails. We talk about sort of. I mean, their courts continue to
Yeah,
say, "Hey, you can't do that."
yeah. The courts routinely, regularly. Thank God for that branch of government because the other one's totally supine, meaning the legislative branch.
Yeah.
Uh, so the courts continue to operate. That is a thing for which there is precedent. The courts, continue to act like the courts mostly, and they keep Trump from doing various things that he wants to do. And I guess here's the thing that's worth thinking about. I guess in this context, and maybe you have an insight on this that because I've just started thinking about it. It's like if you look at what has happened just in the last few days around the big beautiful bill. There's these things that Trump, campaigned on, right? No taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime. He recently, as you know, last week came out and said, having kind of been toing and froing about it for a while, finally came out and said to Mike Johnson, "Let's raise taxes on the rich." I mean,
Right.
he set the limit really high at 2.5 million, but he said he'd be open to he wants that, not just he'd be open to it,
Right.
but he wants that. That's not going to happen. Um,
No.
and nor are a lot of things that he campaigned on, pretty vocally, like no taxes on
Yeah.
tips. And his that
Unfeasible.
it's not like the Republicans are standing up and saying, um, getting in his face about it. They're just not going to do that. You know, it's a
Right.
thing he wanted. They're not going to do it.
Right.
Um, he capitulated on the U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia. Tom Tillis said, "No, I'm not gonna. This is fucking nuts." And Trump was like, "All right." No, he put in Janine Perot. How long that will last, who knows? But it's like there's things where he's kind of giving up on things,
Right.
rather than stomping his feet and saying, "I must have this, I must have that." There's more things that he's willing to kind of like when somebody says no to him, he kind of goes, "All right." The interesting question is like what's going to happen with the plane and just all of the obvious corruption, right? Because there's more Republicans speaking out about that than I've heard speak out about almost anything in
Right.
this term.
Cynthia Loomis burst into hysterical laughter when she heard about it.
Yes, I mean, Laurel Loomer is attacking him. Ted Cruz, Ben Shapiro, all these people are like saying, "What? This is like you can't take this plane from Qatar. That's crazy." And what happens now? And here's the thing that ties the two things together for me. Do you think that Trump being willing to kind of give up on shit he doesn't really care about that much, like, does he really care about like raising taxes on the wealthy?
Right.
You know, if Trump were really running for a third term, like
Right.
really thought that he had a political future, I think he might not take the plane from Qatar, because the
Right.
corruption of it's really
Right.
so naked that
Right. It
that
is
it's a political
unbelievable.
liability. if Trump were really running for a third term, he might want to like really press for raising taxes on the rich because that's like
Right.
good Bannon-esque like populist economics. I
Yeah.
wonder whether we're starting to like, and both that his behavior and the fact that Republicans are starting to either just kind of ignore him on certain things or
Mm,
openly criticize him, like on the plane, whether what's sinking in with people. And I say this as someone who's thought for a long time Trump was going to stay in the White House until he was dead or
right.
taken out, either leave the Oval Office with a toe tag or in handcuffs. Those are the only ways you're going to get him out. I, I I wonder whether it's starting to like on both sides. People are kind of going, yeah, you know what? Two term. Like I mean, we got another 4 years to get to do whatever the fuck I want, but I'm not gonna try to press it here and try to stick around
Right.
for a third. I wonder.
Right. I mean, it is the real open question, right? Is how much energy does he have for the authoritarianism he is very delighted and curious by? And that's the question.
Yeah, and whether he think yes, that's certainly right. And I don't mean to suggest at all that the authoritarian threat is receded,
No,
but
agree.
just that on certain things he just seems more exhausted, you know, than he
It's just,
has in the past. He just sort of seems kind of like, the answers to some of these questions, in these interviews he's done recently, he has just seemed so flaccid to me. Like he's kind of
mhm.
like Stephen Miller's still out there talking about repeal it, taking back about getting rid of habeas corpus, and that's super dangerous. And but I just there are times when you look at Trump and you kind of go, he looks like he's just like a little like he's a little like kind of had it. He's kind of
Yeah.
like, okay,
Yeah.
I just don't
No.
have that much energy anymore. Let's just
And
get on with like
and my
give me the
man is
money. Give me the
right.
money.
Right.
Let me build the giant hotel in Qatar and let my
Right.
family get really rich. You can't prosecute me because I got immunity. Let's just like, let me give me as much shit as I can get a hold of in the next 4 years and I'll like go off. Thank you.
And my man is in his late 70s. I mean, this is not a young guy.
Yes, and a lot of mileage on those tires too, Molly. I mean, it's, if you get to be that age, I don't care what kind of genetics you have. If you get to be that age and you've only eaten like Big Macs and not done any exercise other than what passes for him playing around in golf,
Right.
that body is not cannot be like I don't care what his doctor says. That body cannot
Right.
be in the best shape.
Well, and also he doesn't sleep. I mean, the guy
Right.
lives a
Yeah.
very frenetic, high stress life. So
Yes.
there's a book that's coming out that says that basically there was a cover up about Biden's age. I have yet to see anything that threads a needle for cover up. It just seems like if I could, it all seems like people were, the things people do when other people are in power or they want them to stay in power. It doesn't seem, in my mind, like if only Democrats were organized enough for a cover up, is my hot take. But
You're
I'm
talking about
curious,
you're talking about Tapper Thompson.
the Tapper Thompson book. Yeah.
So I haven't read it. I'm going to interview those guys on my podcast, and as I'm sure you are and others are, they're going to publicize the book like crazy. I'm eager to read it. Those are two serious people who are good reporters and are well
Right.
sourced. And Alex Thompson was commendably uh, resistant to the aggressive White House pushback on Biden age and health stories. Over
But
the
wasn't
well, he was in.
everybody like, didn't you read a ton of stories about how Biden was old and doddering and
I think that you didn't know. No, I mean, yes, what you read was a lot of people. First of all, you read a lot of people on the right saying that all the time. I
right,
don't think that you would say that on MSNBC, CNN, uh, and otherwise that there was a lot of like aggressive coverage
well,
that kind of made that point. I spent, we've talked about this before, I'm sure on this podcast, but I spent when I would say on television, not like doing trying to investigate this, but just would say there is a consistent through line starting in October of 2021 through whatever point you were talking that the American public thinks Joe Biden's too old for run for a second term.
right. And they said it.
But I would say that and then and get brutalized. And there were not a lot of people brutalized in social media and by Democrats. And you wouldn't get a chorus of people who were like, yes, this is a giant problem for Joe Biden politically. And why isn't the Democratic Party running why isn't there a real primary? Why is no one taking him
Right,
on? That
right,
was not something that you heard. That was not something that was like that was front and center in the coverage going forward. And so, but your point is about cover up. So I don't know what the book alleges. So I don't want to like knock down a straw man here.
right, right, right.
My sense of it is that it's a much more interesting, complicated thing.
Right.
there is no doubt that the White House did what every White House always does for any incumbent president, which is to try to push
Exactly.
reporters away from their political vulnerabilities and
Right.
towards their political strengths.
Right. And
And
it would be malpractice to not.
that's what they did. So that's what they did. Um, I think there were a lot of reporters who the Biden press shop and was there uh openness about um when you started to hear things like, I'll give you an example. Um, in like the fall of 2023, actually more like the winter of 2024, was when people who were donors started saying to me they thought it was that Biden looked really bad, even in small
Hmm.
groups, and
Yeah.
was even for like a 10-minute off the record thing with big donors was reading off a teleprompter.
Yeah.
I
That's
didn't
right.
see that. That was not reported widely. Now, was that because those were closed fundraisers? The White House obviously didn't want people to know that. That's what any White House would have done to try to protect their boss on an issue of political vulnerability.
Hmm.
Reporters didn't seem to really super aggressively pursue it. The questions around why the Democratic Party, which is a political party, last I checked,
Theoretically.
and as a political party, should be interested primarily in two things. One, um, its preferred policies, programs, values, ideology, whatever. But prior to that, having to win elections so that you could institute your policies, priorities,
Right.
values, and ideology. Why the Democratic Party, all these congressmen, senators, donors who saw Biden with some frequency in various settings and now have come out and said that they had private concerns, why those people didn't speak up and say, hey, if we're a serious political party, we should consider, someone should come forward and challenge the president. Like,
Right.
why, we have concerns about this. Why did they not raise the alarm earlier? I think that's a really good question, but I think that speaks more to the way that the system works to it is the case that challenging a sitting president is really hard for a lot of reasons. It's hard because it's hard to raise the money to challenge that person. It's hard because if you challenge that person and don't win, your future is fucked in the party.
Yeah.
And there's all this institutional stuff that basically protects incumbents. And
Right.
I think that there were a lot of Democrats who were in denial about his situation. There were a
Right.
lot of Democrats who didn't want to really know the details. They kind of thought he looked tired, but then he would give a good State of the Union. They'd be like, okay, whew, we can get through. Trump is fucking crazy. He's
Right.
failing
Right.
also.
Right.
And there were a lot of Democrats out there who might have challenged Biden, who looked at it and said, you know, the White House is a juggernaut. They have a lot of money. It's really hard to beat an incumbent. Do I want to mortgage my future or risk my future as a presidential candidate in 2028, 2032, 2036 to taking on a sitting president where if I don't win, everyone in the institutional Democratic Party is going to hate me forever? I think like there's much more like was a much more the story here isn't so much a giant cover up in the way we think of a cover up as a series of institutional things that led a lot of people to forget what the point of being the Democratic Party was, which is, or any party is, which is you got to win, you know,
See,
and it's not, you shouldn't mortgage your values or your preferred policies. You shouldn't do anything to win. That's not win at all cost. That's not stop
but you have
believing
to
in,
want to win.
but you have to win. If you don't win,
Right.
this is what happens. You get Donald Trump for the next 4 years. So, you have to, first things first, consistent with
Right.
your priorities, consistent with your values, consistent with your ethics. You have to do everything you can to win. And
Yeah.
that the Democratic Party was not operating on that principle when it looked just at Joe Biden's poll numbers. Forget about what people saw behind the scenes. If you just looked at his poll numbers, you would have said, we have a problem.
Yeah.
For like 2
Yeah.
years, you would have said, we have a problem. And,
Yeah.
there were, again, we could go on forever here about this, but you have some countervailing things. Biden was able to look up after the midterms and say, hey, y'all said that we were going to get killed in the midterms. We didn't get killed in the midterms. Y'all think I can't give a decent speech? I did okay at the State of the Union. He had things to point to.
Right.
But,
Right. Right.
but again, 2.5 years of polling and what you could see, which was that without saying the guy had Alzheimer's or had dementia or had just the
Right.
guy was old.
And
He
he
looked his
looked old.
age. He looked
Right.
his age. And you if
And
you looked at that guy and say he looked his age, he's not at his best. He's lost a lot of miles per hour of his fastball.
right.
We probably, if we really think democracy is on the line, we probably should consider some other alternatives because this is not who you put forward in an existential election.
But it is interesting now. So Biden was the oldest person ever to be president. Now Donald Trump is the oldest person to ever
Right.
be president.
Right.
And this sort of dovetails back to what we were talking about before, which is that as someone who has dealt and just wrote a book about aging parents and my experience with my aging parents and et cetera, et cetera. Getting old is not a conspiracy theory. It's what happens to all of us.
Yes. And anybody who's ever dealt with anybody in their 80s
Yeah.
knows that it is not ageism, nor is it disrespectful to say people in their 80s are not who you want driving a Formula One car, flying your airplane, or being president of the United States. It's not, they are diminished in various ways. Do they have wisdom that we don't have? Maybe. Sometimes, yes, if they're wise. Like they have certain, like some of them do, not all of them. I'm not ready to say everyone who's 80 is wiser than me, but I'm saying some are, but they don't have the reflexes of a 40-year-old, and they don't have the energy or the stamina, and they don't have the sharpness, or they don't have the recall. They have a lot of things that have diminished by that age. And so you have to ask that question. It was, to say someone is, it's not like, you would say, he's getting on in years. People would go, you're saying that people in their 80s are worthless. I'm like, no, I'm not saying they're worthless. I'm just saying they probably are not the best person to have the hardest job in the world.
I mean, the one thing I would say, and I'm not trying to be argumentative here, is I do think that Nancy Pelosi, as I hold up a yellow crayon, God help me, that Nancy Pelosi is pretty sharp.
Yes, I'm not saying there aren't exceptions to the
Right,
rule,
right, but
Molly.
there are exceptions to the rule, and I
Is
think
there
that's the play.
are there exceptions to the rule? There are exceptions to every rule. I'm just trying to
Right.
say, as a general thing, I am very much in the Jon Stewart camp, which was when he first came back and was like, both of these guys are too old to be president. In 350, I heard this all over the country, which was people would come up to me and go, whether they were Democrats or Republicans, would be like, really? Two octogenarian dudes, who
Right,
both of whom, when you watch them, one of whom seems bonkers. That's Trump.
right.
And the other of
Yes,
whom seems like pretty frail as I watch
yes,
him
that's
shuffle
Biden.
across the South Lawn.
Yeah,
Is this really the best we can do? That was what the
yes,
question that people would give. And I was always like, that's a totally reasonable question. That like,
right.
and again, it's not a diss to Joe Biden or his years of service or the various things that have made him wise, but like, you
I think
know,
at this point, it's just a truism
yes.
about 2024.
And people who would make this point most pointedly to me, people in their 80s
Yeah.
who would say, I, I am not what I once was. I wouldn't want this job of president. Like, what are we talking about here? It wasn't like elderly people were like, rallying around Joe Biden constantly. They were kind of going, maybe we should look at someone younger.
Yeah. No, it's true, and I think a really good point. John, I hope you will come back.
I'll always come back. I'll always
Yes,
come
come
back.
back.
And if I didn't tell you this story before,
Please.
I'll tell you it now. It's my last, it's on exactly on the point we were just on. I've told it 100 times, but I'll tell it now because
I would
it
like
was
it.
literally the funniest thing that happened in the whole of the 2024 election cycle to me. That
Not that anything funny happened to you during that. Anyway, go on. Yes.
Saturday night after the Republican convention, you'll recall this weird span of time where Trump assassination attempt, a convention in Milwaukee, and then other things that happened immediately thereafter. So the Saturday night after the Republican convention ended on a Thursday. Saturday night, Dave Chappelle and Jon Stewart did a comedy set at the kind of like a friends and family show at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. And John told this story in his set. He said to the crowd, I just came back. I've been back on 6 months. I've been getting a lot of crap from Democrats because I came out at the very beginning and said that both of these guys are too old to be president.
Right.
And it's been really hard for me because how many people in the crowd have had someone in their 80s who they've had to do something hard in their family, an uncle, a grandfather, a grandmother, a mother, a father, whatever, where they've had to do something hard, like take away their driver's license or their car keys. Everyone's hand went up in the room.
Right.
And Stewart said, yeah, well, it happened with me with my Nana. My Nana was in her 90s and we had to take her away her driver's license. And it was the hardest thing we'd ever done. It was the last shred of her independence. She just like was clinging to this one thing. She was kind of like, don't take my driver's license. That's basically like putting me in the grave. But my family rallied. We did the hard thing. We had the hard conversations and we finally got her to give up her driver's license. It was really painful, but it was the right thing to do. But it was really painful.
Right.
And then he said, now just imagine we were trying to do that with 20 million people going, let the bitch drive. Like
Let the
that's how it's
bitch
felt with
drive.
me and Joe Biden. Let the bitch drive,
Bitch drive.
and
Let the bitch drive.
that made me laugh and will make me laugh forever.
Yeah, let the bitch drive. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, Molly.
Bye.